The first thing Marin Koss noticed when she descended into the SC-iFi array was the sound it made when it breathed. Not a mechanical sound. Not the hum of coolant cycling through superconducting magnets or the low percussion of electromagnetic fields phasing in and out. Something older than that. Something that lived below the threshold of instrumentation, in the place where physics stopped being numbers and started being feeling. A pressure in the chest. A tightening behind the eyes. The sensation, unmistakable once you'd felt it, that the universe was aware of you. She'd been working in the array for 11 months. She stopped noticing it around month 2. That was a mistake she wouldn't understand until much later. The SC-iFi array was humanity's second attempt at a particle accelerator of civilizational scale. The first had been buried under Geneva, built in a more innocent century when humans still thought the universe would yield its secrets politely. The array was different. The array was an apology. It stretched 47 kilometers under the Icelandic plateau, its ring of superconducting dipole magnets cooled to 1.9 Kelvin, colder than the void between galaxies, running proton beams at energies that made the old CERN machine look like a child's toy. It had taken 31 years and the GDP of 11 nations to build. It had been operational for 14 months. In that time, it had done what it was designed to do. It had looked deeper into the structure of matter than any instrument in human history. And Marin Koss, senior collision analyst and the youngest person ever to hold that title, had found something in the data that she could not explain, could not dismiss, and could not stop thinking about. She pulled up the collision readout on her tablet as she walked the maintenance corridor, her breath misting in the cold, her boots ringing off the concrete floor. The readout showed what it always showed. The aftermath of proton-proton collisions at 14 TeV, particle tracks blooming outward like time-lapse flowers, the decay signatures of short-lived exotic particles, the orderly chaos of quantum mechanics at its most fundamental. Beautiful, in the way that only things beyond human imagination could be beautiful when you'd spent enough years learning to read them. But underneath all of that, invisible in the standard analyses, present only when you applied a particular sequence of non-standard filters that Marin had developed herself over the course of 6 sleepless weeks, was something else. A pattern, not a particle. Not an energy signature, not anything that belonged in a collision readout at all. It looked, if you squinted and allowed yourself the indulgence of analogy, like an annotation. Like someone had left a note in the margins of the universe she had told no one. Not because she was secretive by nature, but because she was precise. And she wasn't finished being precise yet. She needed to be sure. She needed to rule out every possible artifact, every instrumental quirk, every statistical fluke that might produce a ghost in the data. She had been ruling them out, one by one, for 4 months. She was running out of things to rule out. The corridor ended at a service ladder. She climbed down into the tunnel itself, the real gut of the array, where the beam pipe ran through its ring of blue-white magnets like an artery. The sound was louder here, the breathing. She'd come to think of it as breathing. In the 11 months she'd spent working in the array, she had never once felt afraid of it. She felt it now. A small cold thing, separate from the temperature of the tunnel, nested just below her sternum. She took out her personal notebook, paper, not digital, old habit, and wrote the number again. 17. The pattern appeared in collision readouts exactly 17 times per hour, not approximately. Not on average. Exactly. It did not matter what energy level she ran the beam at. It did not matter what collision parameters she adjusted. The pattern appeared exactly 17 times per hour, regular as a heartbeat, with a precision that no known physical process could account for. The universe didn't work in round numbers. Physical processes didn't run on schedules. Something was counting. She stood in the tunnel for a long time, listening to the breathing of the array, and wrote a second number underneath the first. She wrote it because she had finally, after 4 months of trying to find another explanation, allowed herself to consider the one that remained. The number was the year the first primitive human particle accelerator, a crude cyclotron at Berkeley, had gone online. 1930. The pattern had started in 1930. She didn't know how she knew that. She knew it the way she knew her own name. Something had been watching. Her name at CERN, before the array, before Iceland, had been something of a legend. Not because she was brilliant, though she was, but because of the way she worked. Marin Koss did not take shortcuts. Her colleagues joked that she would rather spend a week ruling out the wrong answer than spend an hour entertaining the right one. Her thesis advisor had said she had the rarest quality in physics. She was genuinely afraid of being wrong, Not afraid of failure, afraid of error. They were different things. Failure you could recover from, error you carried. She was 34 years old. She had been doing physics since she was 9. She had never published a result she wasn't certain of. She left the tunnel at 0300, went back to her office, and opened a secure communication channel to the one person at the array whose judgment she trusted absolutely. Dr. Yusuf Haley answered on the second ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. "I need you to look at something," she said. There was a pause. Yusuf was Somali-American, built like a former athlete run slightly to fat, with eyes that were always doing 3 things at once. He had been her postdoctoral supervisor at MIT, and was now in the official hierarchy her peer. In every way that actually mattered, he was her anchor. "Is it the thing you've been not telling me about?" he said. "Yes, I've been waiting. How bad?" "I don't know yet. That's why I need you to look at it." He looked at it. It took him 3 hours. At the end of those 3 hours, he sat back in his chair, on the video feed, and was quiet for a long moment. His expression was not the expression of a man who'd found a flaw in her methodology. It was the expression of a man who'd been hoping to find one. "Marin," he said, "I know. You understand what you're saying. I'm not saying anything yet. I'm showing you data. The data is saying it." She nodded. Outside her window, the Icelandic dawn was beginning, gray and flat. A skein of geese crossed the brightening sky. She watched them. Normal things, doing normal things. "Who else have you told?" Yusuf asked. "Nobody." "Good." He hesitated. "Keep it that way for now. I need to verify your filter chain independently. Give me a week." She gave him a week. At the end of it, he called her at 200 and said very quietly, "It's real." She had expected to feel relieved. She felt afraid instead. They called it the signal. It was not, they were increasingly certain, a signal in the sense of a transmission, not a message, not a beacon. It was something more like a watch mechanism, a system that registered the occurrence of high-energy particle collisions and logged them with an annotation that existed at a level of structure below what current physics could fully describe. As if the universe had a ledger. As if someone, somewhere, was keeping track of how close the apes with the big brains were getting. Marin wrote this in her paper notebook, sitting in her kitchen at 0400, eating crackers because she'd forgotten to buy real food. She crossed it out, then wrote it again. She crossed it out again. The problem wasn't the science. The problem was the implication. If the signal was what it appeared to be, a monitoring mechanism, precise and consistent and utterly non-random, then it had been in operation since 1930, which meant it had been in operation before the LHC, before any human had ever built a machine capable of the energy scales required to generate it, which meant either the signal had lain dormant in the structure of space-time, waiting to be activated by the right energy threshold, or something had placed it there in anticipation of exactly what humanity would eventually build. Neither option was comforting. She had been a scientist for 25 years. She had learned to sit with discomfort. She had learned that the universe did not owe her an explanation she'd find pleasant. She sat with the discomfort now and tried to think clearly. The thing she kept coming back to was this. If something had placed a monitoring system in the fundamental structure of matter, and if that monitoring system triggered whenever humans pushed their particle physics past a certain threshold, that was not the behavior of something that meant humans well. That was the behavior of something that had decided, at some point in the past, that it needed to keep an eye on things. That it needed to know when certain lines were being approached. She thought about the old debates around CERN, the protesters, the lawsuits, the op-eds claiming the collider would destroy the world. She had always found those debates embarrassing, scientifically illiterate. Now she sat in her kitchen at 0400 and thought, what if the fear was right, but the mechanism was wrong? What if the collider wasn't going to destroy the world? What if it was going to alert someone? She ate another cracker. It tasted like nothing. She went back to her notebook and wrote a number, 14. The Kelavar array operated at 14 TeV. He'd been running a secondary analysis for 6 weeks, trying to determine whether the signal changed in character at higher energies. The results were preliminary, and she hadn't told Yusuf about them yet. But what they suggested was this. At 14 TeV, the signal looked like a passive log. At 20 TeV, the array's theoretical maximum, never yet achieved, it looked like something else. She couldn't fully characterize it yet, but the mathematical structure was different in a way that suggested a different function. Threshold. The word came to her and sat there. What happens when we cross the threshold? She didn't write that down. She didn't need to. It was already written everywhere she looked. The breakdown, when it came, was not dramatic. It was not a screaming collapse or a violent episode. It was quieter than that and worse. It was the moment, 3 weeks after Yusuf had confirmed the signal, when Marin sat at her workstation and opened her analysis software and could not make herself run the data. Her hands were on the keyboard, her eyes were on the screen. The code was all there, correct, ready to execute. She had run it every day for months. She sat there for 2 hours and could not press the key. She went to the array's medical officer, a Scots-Nigerian woman named Dr. Adaze, who was brisk and practical and listened without expression while Marin described, in the most clinical language she could manage, what she had found and what it was doing to her. "The data is telling me something," Marin said. "I can't stop thinking about what it means." "What do you think it means?" Marin looked at the wall. There was a poster on it, the periodic table, dog-eared at one corner, normal things. "I think it means we're not alone, and I think whatever's out there knew we'd get here. And I think they planned for it." Adiez wrote something in her notebook. "Are you sleeping? Not well. Eating? Approximately. I'm going to recommend you take 2 weeks of leave. Compulsory rest. You can contest it if you want, but I think you know I'm right." Marin did not contest it. She went home. Home was a rented house 20 kilometers from the array, at the edge of a small town with a church that was older than the United States, a harbor with a dozen fishing boats, and a bakery that opened at 5 in the morning and smelled of cardamom. She had chosen it for the commute and stayed for the smell. She told herself she was going to rest. She worked from home, instead, quietly, without telling anyone. What she found, working from home in those 2 weeks, was not what she'd expected to find. She had been looking at the signal from the inside, from the data, from the physics, trying to understand its structure. On day 3 of her leave, staring at a graph she'd made from the last 18 months of collision data, she shifted her frame of reference. Instead of asking what the signal was, she asked when it changed. The answer came back immediately, from her own data, and it hit her like cold water. The signal had changed 3 times in 14 months of array operation. The changes were subtle, not in frequency, which remained exactly 17 per hour, but in structure. The mathematical shape of the annotation had shifted, incrementally, each time the array had run a full-power test at energies above 12 TeV. 3 changes, 3 escalations. As if something was paying closer attention each time. As if something was preparing. She called Yusuf at 0600 and said, "I need to send you something." She heard him breathe. "How bad?" "Different kind of bad," she said. "Come look." She went back to work after her 2 weeks. She was functional. She was careful about functional. She knew the difference between being functional and being well, and she was content with functional for now. She did her job. She ran her standard analyses. She ate actual meals. She slept approximately enough. She did not stop working on the signal, but she had changed the nature of what she was working toward. She had started, in those 2 weeks at home, to think about what you did with information like this. Not publish it. Publication would take too long, and the review process would create a paper trail that she had reasons, which she kept carefully below the level of articulating, for not wanting, not give it to the array's administration. She had worked for institutional hierarchies long enough to know that information which frightened administrators tended to disappear into committees. She thought about what the signal actually was. She thought about what it was for. And one morning, eating cardamom toast at her kitchen table, watching the geese come in over the harbor, she thought about the threshold, about 20 TeV, about what the signal looked like at that energy level, about the fact that the array had never been run at full power because the engineering team had identified a resonance risk in the southern quadrant that required a magnet replacement, and the replacement had been delayed 6 months due to supply chain issues. She thought about these things for a long time. Then she called Yusuf again. She did not call him on the standard channels. She called him on the encrypted app they had set up during a period, 2 years ago, when they'd both been doing consulting work for a defense contractor that required secure communication. She had never deleted it. She had not known why she hadn't deleted it. She knew now. "I need to tell you something," she said when he answered. "I need you to hear all of it before you respond." She told him everything. The threshold analysis, the escalating changes in the signal's structure, the supply chain delay on the magnet replacement, the timeline. Yusuf was quiet for a long time. The call connection hissed softly. "You're talking about running at 20, he said. "I'm talking about being ready to," she said. "I'm talking about thinking very carefully about what happens when we do. about what the signal looks like at that energy, about whether there's information in that structure that tells us something about what they do next. Or triggers it. Or triggers it, she agreed. Yes. Another long silence. The geese were on the harbor now. She could see them from the window, 14 of them. She'd started counting things. Marin, Yusuf said. There's another possibility. I know. The threshold, it might work both ways. I know. If crossing it triggers a response, but crossing it also gives us access to whatever's on the other side of it. If there's information there, structure, something we could use. That's the one I keep coming back to, she said. We'd be ringing the doorbell. We'd be ringing the doorbell with a very specific question. The harbor was flat and silver. The geese moved on it in their slow, purposeful way, going wherever geese went. Okay, Yusuf said. Tell me what you need. What she needed was access. Not official access, she had that, in abundance. She needed the kind of access that didn't leave logs. The Kelevar array ran its operational parameters through a control system that was, by any reasonable standard, well secured. She was one of 12 people with the authorization codes to modify beam energy targets. The modification would be logged. The logs would be reviewed. She spent 2 weeks doing something she had never done before in her professional life. She prepared a cover story. It felt like betraying herself. She did it anyway. She prepared a secondary analysis that showed a plausible scientific reason to run a high-energy test at 19.8 TeV. Not quite 20, not quite the threshold. Close enough to get the structural data she needed without triggering whatever came next. She brought it to the department head, Dr. Ellison, a careful and politically minded Norwegian who always wore the same blue sweater and who valued institutional caution above almost everything. She made the case. She was precise and unhurried. She answered every question. Ellison approved a test window. She went back to her office and sat very still for a moment. She thought about Yusuf's phrase, ringing the doorbell. She thought about what you did when you rang a doorbell and the door opened. She thought about whether you could build a frame in 2 weeks that would let you look at what was on the other side without being looked at in return. She did not know the answer. She started building the frame anyway. The test was scheduled for a Tuesday. In the week before it, 3 things happened. The first, Marin's workstation flagged an anomaly in the standard diagnostic runs, a brief 2-second dropout in signal frequency, the first deviation from 17 per hour in 14 months of recorded data. She ran it back. She ran it forward. She ran it through every filter she had. It was real. Something had changed. The second, Yusuf sent her a message on the encrypted channel. 7 words. They've been in the building's network since March. She had not known about this. She thought for a moment about what it meant. She thought about the signal changing. She thought about the escalation pattern. She thought about the word preparing. She replied to Yusuf with 2 words. How deep? He replied, deep enough. Not the operational systems. Observation only. For now. The third thing happened the night before the test. She was in the array at 0200, doing a final check of the instrumentation chain, when she found a modification in the collision analysis software. Not in her analysis software, in the standard suite. In the software that processed every collision readout generated by the array. The modification was elegant, surgical. It would be nearly impossible to detect without knowing exactly where to look. She knew where to look because she'd spent 3 months building her own custom filter chain, and the modification touched 3 of the same data structures her filters touched. It was a deletion routine, triggered post-collection. Every readout generated by the array was processed through it, and what it deleted very precisely was any trace of the signal. Something had already been here, had already decided that humans shouldn't be able to see what the array was showing them, had come in through the building's network in March and quietly corrected for the problem of Marin costs. She stood in the maintenance corridor at 0200 in the cold with this information and felt several things simultaneously. Fear, she was used to that now. Anger, that was new. She did not have much of it usually. She was a scientist. She dealt in data. But someone had come into her work and deleted her findings, carefully, from the inside. Had decided that she wasn't allowed to know what she knew. And she felt a sharp, very human anger about that. The same anger she'd felt as a 9-year-old being told girls didn't do physics. The same anger she'd felt a dozen times since, whenever she had encountered the specific arrogance of assuming someone else gets to decide what you're allowed to understand. And beneath the fear and the anger, something else, small and solid. Something that had been there for a long time, underneath everything. The quality her thesis advisor had identified. the genuine fear of being wrong, which had another face, which from the other side looked like this. She was not wrong. She had been careful. She had been more careful than she had ever been. The data was real. The pattern was real. The deletion routine was real. Everything she had feared was confirmed by the existence of the thing that had tried to prevent her from knowing it. She sat down on the floor of the maintenance corridor, back against the beam pipe housing, and wrote 3 numbers in her notebook. 17, 19, 30, 20. Then she wrote a 4th. Tomorrow. The test was scheduled for 900. She arrived at 0700, ran her pre-test checks, drank bad coffee from the machine in the break room, and talked to 3 different colleagues about 3 completely ordinary things. She was very good at ordinary when she needed to be. At 0845, she went to the main control room, took her station, and pulled up the beam control interface. Yusuf was at the adjacent station. He did not look at her. He did not need to. The room filled up gradually as the test window approached. 6 operators, 2 engineers, Ellison in the back with his coffee, the usual quiet choreography of a high-energy run. Marin checked her instrumentation. She checked it again. She had spent the previous night reinstalling a clean version of the analysis software, patched with her own monitoring code, on an isolated system that ran its own separate data capture. Whatever the deletion routine did to the main system, it would not touch her backup. The deletion routine, she had not told anyone about it. She had not removed it. She had left it exactly where it was and built around it. The way you built around a sensor you knew about. The way every physicist learned to build around systematic error you couldn't eliminate. You didn't fight it. You characterized it. You extracted what you needed from around it. They began the ramp-up at 0900. Proton beams injected into the ring, accelerated in stages through the superconducting magnet lattice, energy climbing steadily toward the target. The control room was quiet. Instruments spoke in numbers. The breathing of the array filled the sub-audible frequencies, and Marin, who had spent 11 months in this building, felt it in her chest like a second heartbeat. 12 TeV, 13, 14, the standard operating range. The signal on her isolated system running at exactly 17 per hour. 15 TeV, 16. She watched the structural analysis. The signal's mathematical character was shifting. The same incremental change she'd seen in the historical data. But now she was watching it live, her own filtron chain tracking the details. The annotations in the margins of the universe becoming clearer, more detailed, as if something was waking up. 17 TeV, 18, Ellison said, looking good. Stable beam. Stable, one of the engineers confirmed. 19 TeV. Her hands were absolutely still on the console. She was aware of the sound the array made, the breathing, the pressure in her chest, and she was aware of Yusuf 3 feet to her left, also still. 19.8 TeV. The approved target. She ran the analysis. She captured everything her isolated system would take. And then, because she had decided 3 nights ago, on the floor of the maintenance corridor, because she had been afraid and angry and certain, because she was a scientist, and scientists did not stop at the edge of what was currently permissible when the data was right there. Because some things were more important than institutional caution, and this was one of them. She kept going. Marin, Yusuf said very quietly. I see it. We're past target. I know. She pushed the beam energy to 20 TeV, the first time in 14 months of array operation. The first time in human history. The sound changed. Not the instrumentation, the sound, the breathing. Whatever lived in the sub-frequency range of the array's operation, whatever had been there since month 2, and she'd stopped noticing, rose in pitch and character, and became something she had no word for. Not threatening, not welcoming, not anything that fit a human category. It was the sound of something paying attention, the sound of a door somewhere considering whether to open. Her isolated systems screamed data. She watched it, hands still, face blank. The signal structure at 20 TeV was not like the passive log at 14. It was not like the escalated observation she'd seen at intermediate energies. It was a transmission, directional, structured. Not pointed at the array, pointed outward, into the space around the array, compressed into frequencies she'd need days to fully decode. But in the first seconds with the preliminary analysis running, she could see enough of the structure to understand what it was. A report, a status update, a message to something that was not in the building, not in the country, possibly not on the planet. She read the message, or the first layer of it, what she could parse in the seconds she had. It said, threshold achieved, species, confirmed, classification active developmental, recommended action. She didn't get the rest. The beam destabilized at 20.1 TeV, The resonance risk in the southern quadrant, the one the engineering team had identified, the one they'd been waiting on the magnet replacement for. And the run ended in an automatic shutdown. Emergency protocols engaging, the arrays going dark in its orderly, practiced way. Ellison was on his feet. Engineers were talking rapidly. The standard choreography of an unexpected shutdown. Marin sat at her console, hands still, and looked at the last line of her isolated system's data capture. The words. Recommended action. She didn't have the rest. She didn't need it. She understood, with the certainty she only felt when the data was right and she was right. What came after those words? What had always come after those words? In the entire history of first contacts, of species assessments, of the specific calculus of power, deciding what to do with something new that had just made itself known. She looked at Yusuf, he looked back. She reached into her bag and took out her notebook. She wrote 2 more numbers. Then she stood up and started building the answer. What she built, over the next 6 weeks. Working with Yusuf through the encrypted channel. Working with the clean copy of the analysis software. Working in the maintenance corridors of the array, at hours when nobody else was there. Was not a weapon. She did not have a weapon. She was a physicist, not a soldier, and the thing she was dealing with had already demonstrated the capacity to access human digital infrastructure at will, to modify fundamental software undetected, to monitor every high-energy experiment run on the planet for nearly a century. What she built was a question. The signal, at 20 TeV, had transmitted a report. It was a one-way mechanism, a status update sent to something elsewhere. But the structure of the signal at that energy level was bidirectional by design. She had seen it in the data. The transmission went out. It was built to receive a response, a handshake, an acknowledgement. If you could intercept the handshake channel, if you could insert a carrier signal into the frequency structure of the response pathway, below the level that the deletion routine would catch, tied to the signal's own encryption structure, which she had spent 6 weeks reverse engineering from the data, you could send something back along that channel. Something small. Something that looked, from the outside, like noise. Something that contained a question. The question she chose was not eloquent. She was not trying to be eloquent. She chose it because it was precise, and because it was honest, and because she had been a scientist for 25 years. And the thing she had been most consistently taught, by every good physicist she had ever known, was that you didn't hide what you knew. You didn't let fear or politics or institutional caution make you pretend you hadn't found what you'd found. You said what you saw. You put it on record. You made it impossible to ignore. She encoded the question into the carrier signal, and she inserted it into the response pathway, and she waited. The magnet replacement came through in week 5. The engineering team scheduled a test run for week 7. She was ready in week 6. The second full power run went smoothly. 20 TeV, achieved and held no resonance incident. The automatic systems ran. The deletion routine ran, pruning the standard data feeds. Her isolated system ran, capturing everything separate and untouched. The signal went out. The handshake response came back, and in the response pathway woven into the structure of the acknowledgement was her carrier signal. Her question. She captured the full response. She ran the analysis. Yusuf, at his station, was very still. The response was longer than she'd expected. She had sent a question. What came back was not precisely an answer, but it was something she hadn't anticipated. Something she understood, when she'd decoded enough of it to be. Not a message from whoever was on the other end of the signal. A message from the signal itself. From the monitoring mechanism. From whatever piece of the universe's bookkeeping system they'd stumbled into. The universe, it turned out, kept very thorough records. And the record it returned to her question. The record of what the recommended action had been, going back through every threshold achieved, every species-end event, every status update transmissions, sent out through this and every other signal like it, across however many worlds and however many centuries. The record was not what she'd been afraid it was. It was a library. She read it for 3 hours straight, Yusuf beside her, neither of them speaking. Not all of them made it past the threshold. Not all of them had what happened next happen to them. But some did. Some of the entries, the ones with a different tag, and crossed a different flag in the structure, a characteristic she'd need weeks to fully decode, had something appended. Something that wasn't in the status updates of the ones who didn't make it. Something small. The mathematical equivalent of a thumbs up. A notation. An acknowledgement that the species in question had somehow passed. She searched for the pattern. The thing those entries had in common. What distinguished the ones who made it. She found it in the data eventually. Quiet and unambiguous, they'd asked. The ones who made it past the threshold, who went through and came out the other side, they had in one way or another before the response came, sent a question back. Not fought, not hidden, not been passive recipients of whatever was decided about them. They had made themselves known. They had looked at the monitoring mechanism, the system of surveillance and assessment that had been watching them from the beginning, and they had said, "We see you. We know you're there. We want to know what this is." Marin sat back in her chair and looked at her notebook, the number she'd been writing for 6 months. 17, 1930, 20, tomorrow. She wrote one more. She wrote the number of entries in the library with the flag, the ones who had passed. Species gone before, in the same position humans were in now, who had done what she had just done without knowing it was the thing to do. The number was not large. It was not small either. It was the number of times in the entire history of whatever civilizational scale this mechanism operated on that someone had been curious enough and precise enough and stubborn enough to look at the universe's surveillance apparatus and ask a question instead of waiting to be judged. She thought about her thesis advisor, about the fear of error, about what that fear really was underneath when you stripped away the professional coding. It was love. It was a profound, sustaining love of getting things right, of seeing what was actually there, not what you hoped was there or feared was there, but what was there. She had seen what was there. She had looked at something that had been designed to watch her, and she had looked back. She closed her notebook. "Yusuf," she said. "Yeah, we have a lot of work to do." "I know." Outside, the Icelandic morning was coming in silver and flat, and the geese were on the water, going about their business, and the array breathed its subsonic breath, and the universe kept its ledger, and somewhere in the structure of matter itself, in the annotations at the margins of reality, a record was updated. A species had asked, the flag was set,